The night Jimi Hendrix told Eric Clapton, "You are nothing to me." The rise of two legends. The year was 1966, and the world of rock and roll was experiencing a seismic shift. In London, a city that had become the epicenter of musical innovation, two guitarists were beginning to emerge as the most talented and influential musicians of their generation. One was Eric Clapton, a young British guitarist who had already made a name for himself as a member of the Yardbirds and was now gaining recognition for his work with the blues rock band Cream. The other was Jimi Hendrix, an American guitarist who had recently arrived in London and was about to revolutionize the entire concept of what the electric guitar could do. Eric Clapton was born in 1945 in Surrey, England, and had grown up in a middle-class household. He discovered the blues at a young age, inspired by the recordings of Muddy Waters and other American blues legends. By his late teens, Clapton had become a skilled guitarist, known for his technical proficiency and his ability to capture the essence of the blues in his playing. He was respected by his peers, admired by critics, and was beginning to build a devoted following. Jimi Hendrix, born Johnny Allen Hendrix in 1942 in Seattle, Washington, had taken a much more circuitous route to success. He had grown up in poverty, struggled with the loss of his mother at a young age, and had spent years playing in obscure bands before finally getting his break. But when that break came, it came with a force that would change everything. Jimi had a vision of what the electric guitar could become, a vision that was unlike anything anyone had ever heard before. When Jimi arrived in London in 1966, he was relatively unknown outside of a small circle of musicians and music industry insiders. But within weeks of his arrival, word began to spread about this extraordinary guitarist who was doing things with the electric guitar that seemed to defy the laws of physics. He was playing with his teeth, playing behind his back, creating sounds that had never been heard before. He was not just playing the guitar, he was reinventing it. Eric Clapton was aware of Jimi's arrival in London, but he did not immediately see him as a threat. Clapton was confident in his own abilities, and he had every reason to be. He was already an established figure in the British music scene, respected by other musicians and admired by fans. He believed that his technical skill and his deep understanding of the blues gave him an advantage over this newcomer from America. But as Jimi's reputation grew, as more and more people began to talk about his revolutionary approach to the guitar, Eric Clapton began to feel a sense of unease. He attended one of Jimi's early performances in London, and what he witnessed shook him to his core. Jimi was not just a skilled guitarist. He was a visionary, an artist who was pushing the boundaries of what was possible with the instrument in ways that Clapton had never imagined. The two guitarists moved in similar circles in London's music scene, and it was inevitable that they would eventually meet. When they did, the encounter was cordial but somewhat tense. Both men recognized each other's talent, but there was also an underlying current of competition, a sense that only one of them could be the greatest guitarist of their generation. In the months that followed, Jimi's star continued to rise. His debut album, Are You Experienced?, was released in May 1967 and became an immediate critical and commercial success. Songs like Purple Haze, Foxy Lady, and The Wind Cries Mary became instant classics, and Jimi was hailed as a revolutionary artist who had fundamentally changed what was possible with the electric guitar. Eric Clapton, meanwhile, was also achieving success with Cream, a supergroup that he had formed with bassist Jack Bruce and drummer Ginger Baker. Cream was creating innovative music that blended rock, blues, and psychedelia, and they were gaining a devoted following. But even as Clapton's career was flourishing, he could not help but feel that he was being overshadowed by Jimi Hendrix. The tension between the two guitarists was not just about musical ability or commercial success. It was also about artistic vision, about who had the right to claim the title of the greatest guitarist of their generation. Clapton represented the British blues tradition, a musician who had studied the American blues masters and had learned to play their music with authenticity and respect. Jimi, on the other hand, represented something entirely new, a fusion of blues, rock, and psychedelia that was pushing the boundaries of what rock music could be. By late 1967, both Jimi and Eric were at the height of their powers. They were both young, talented, and ambitious. They were both pushing the boundaries of their art. But they were also both aware that there could only be one king of the guitar, and both of them wanted that crown. If you're fascinated by the untold stories and rivalries between rock and roll's greatest legends, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you the most compelling narratives from music history that reveal the human side of these iconic artists. The Savile Theatre in London was one of the most prestigious venues in the city, a place where only the biggest and most important artists performed. In December 1967, both Jimi Hendrix and Eric Clapton were scheduled to perform there, though on different nights. The Savile Theatre was the kind of venue that represented the pinnacle of success in the British music scene, and both musicians understood the significance of performing there. Jimi's performance at the Savile Theatre was scheduled for December 29, 1967, and it would be one of the most important performances of his career. He had been in London for less than 2 years, but in that time he had become one of the most talked-about musicians in the world. His performances were legendary, filled with technical virtuosity, raw emotion, and a sense of danger that kept audiences on the edge of their seats. Eric Clapton attended Jimi's performance at the Savile Theatre, and what he witnessed that night would stay with him for the rest of his life. Jimi took the stage with the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and from the first note, it was clear that this was not just another rock and roll performance. This was a masterclass in what the electric guitar could do in the hands of a true visionary. Jimi played with a ferocity and creativity that seemed almost superhuman. He bent the strings in ways that seemed impossible, created sounds that had never been heard before, and moved across the stage with a grace and confidence that was mesmerizing. The audience was transfixed, hanging on every note, every gesture, every moment of pure musical genius. Eric Clapton sat in the audience, watching Jimi perform, and he felt something shift inside him. He had come to the performance confident in his own abilities, secure in the knowledge that he was one of the greatest guitarists of his generation. But as he watched Jimi play, he began to realize that he was witnessing something that transcended technical skill or musical knowledge. He was witnessing pure artistic genius, a musician who had fundamentally reimagined what was possible with the electric guitar. After the performance, Jimi and Eric encountered each other backstage. The meeting was brief, but it was charged with tension. Eric congratulated Jimi on his performance, but his words felt hollow, lacking the genuine warmth that one musician typically extends to another. Jimi, for his part, was gracious but distant. He sensed Eric's discomfort, his sense of being overshadowed, and he did not try to ease the tension. In the weeks that followed, Eric Clapton found himself struggling with a complex mixture of emotions. He was inspired by Jimi's music, impressed by his technical skill and his artistic vision. But he was also envious, frustrated by the sense that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he pushed himself, he could never quite reach the level of innovation and creativity that Jimi seemed to achieve so effortlessly. Clapton began to practice more intensely, pushing himself to develop new techniques, to explore new sounds, to find ways to compete with Jimi on the musical stage. But the more he practiced, the more he realized that Jimi was operating on a different level entirely. Jimi was not just a skilled guitarist. He was a visionary, an artist who was creating something entirely new. The rivalry between Jimi and Eric became a topic of conversation in music circles. Fans debated who was the better guitarist. Critics wrote articles comparing their styles and their contributions to rock music. Some argued that Eric's technical skill and his deep understanding of the blues made him the superior musician. Others insisted that Jimi's innovation and his revolutionary approach to the guitar made him the clear winner. But the rivalry was not just about music. It was also about identity, about who had the right to claim the legacy of the blues, about who represented the future of rock and roll. Eric Clapton was a white British musician who had learned the blues from American masters. Jimi Hendrix was a black American musician who was taking the blues and transforming it into something entirely new. This racial and cultural dimension of the rivalry added another layer of complexity to the situation. In the 1960s, the question of who had the right to play the blues, who could authentically represent the blues tradition, was a contentious one. Some argued that only black musicians who had grown up in the blues tradition could truly understand and authentically represent the music. Others believed that the blues was a universal language that could be played and understood by anyone who had the skill and the passion. Jimi, for his part, was aware of these debates, and he was also aware of the way that his success was being interpreted by different communities. He was proud to be a black musician who was achieving success in a predominantly white industry, and he was also proud to be pushing the boundaries of what rock music could be. But he was also aware that his success came at a cost, that there were those who resented his rise, who felt threatened by his talent and his visibility. This rivalry between two guitar legends is one of the most fascinating stories in rock history. If you're enjoying this narrative, please like this video and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on who you believe was the greatest guitarist of that era. Your opinions matter to us. The night that would become legendary in rock and roll history occurred in early 1968 at a private gathering in London. Both Jimi Hendrix and Eric Clapton were present, along with several other musicians and music industry figures. The gathering was meant to be a celebration of music, a chance for talented musicians to come together, to jam, to exchange ideas, and to enjoy each other's company. The atmosphere at the gathering was initially relaxed and convivial. Musicians were playing, talking, sharing stories about their experiences in the music industry. But as the night progressed, and as more alcohol was consumed, the mood began to shift. The conversation became more competitive, more pointed, with musicians beginning to make claims about their own abilities and to challenge the abilities of others. At some point during the evening, Eric Clapton made a comment about Jimi's playing. The exact words have been debated over the years, but the general sentiment was that Eric was suggesting that Jimi's approach to the guitar was more about showmanship and technical tricks than about genuine musical understanding. Eric was arguing that his own approach, rooted in the blues tradition, was more authentic and more meaningful than Jimi's more experimental and innovative style. Jimi listened to Eric's comments with a calm demeanor, but those who were present that night could sense the tension building. Jimi had heard similar criticisms before, had dealt with people who dismissed his music as mere showmanship, who did not understand or appreciate what he was trying to do. But coming from Eric Clapton, a musician whom Jimi respected, the criticism stung more deeply. When Jimi finally responded, his words were measured but devastating. He looked directly at Eric and said, "You are nothing to me." The words hung in the air, shocking everyone present. It was not a statement made in anger or in a moment of heated passion. It was delivered calmly, almost matter-of-factly, which made it all the more powerful. The room fell silent. No one knew quite how to respond to what Jimi had just said. Eric Clapton's face flushed, and he looked away, unable to meet Jimi's gaze. The other musicians present shifted uncomfortably, aware that they had just witnessed a moment of genuine human drama, a moment when the mask of civility had been dropped and raw truth had been spoken. But Jimi was not finished. He continued, explaining what he meant by his statement. He said that Eric's music, while technically proficient and rooted in a legitimate tradition, was ultimately derivative. Eric was playing the blues as they had been played before, honoring the tradition, but not pushing it forward, not creating something new. Jimi, on the other hand, was taking the blues and transforming it, creating something that had never existed before. "You're playing yesterday's music," Jimi said, his voice steady and calm. "I'm playing tomorrow's music. You're looking backward. I'm looking forward. That's the difference between us. You are nothing to me because you represent the past, and I represent the future." The words were harsh, but they were also true, at least from Jimi's perspective. Jimi was not trying to be cruel or to diminish Eric's accomplishments. He was simply stating what he believed to be a fundamental truth about their respective approaches to music and to the guitar. Eric Clapton sat in silence, processing what Jimi had said. He wanted to respond, to defend himself, to argue that his approach to music was just as valid and just as important as Jimi's. But he could not find the words. Deep down, he knew that Jimi was right. He was playing the blues as they had been played before, and while he was doing it well, he was not creating something entirely new. He was not pushing the boundaries of what was possible with the electric guitar in the way that Jimi was. The gathering continued, but the mood had shifted irrevocably. The other musicians present were aware that they had witnessed a moment of genuine confrontation, a moment when two of the greatest guitarists of their generation had come face to face with the fundamental differences in their artistic visions. In the days and weeks that followed, the story of what Jimi had said to Eric began to circulate through the music community. Different versions of the story emerged, with some people claiming that Jimi had been cruel and dismissive, while others argued that he had simply been honest about the fundamental differences between their approaches to music. Eric Clapton, for his part, did not publicly respond to what Jimi had said, but privately, he was deeply affected by the encounter. He began to question his own approach to music, to wonder if he was indeed just playing yesterday's music, if he was truly pushing the boundaries of what was possible with the guitar. The encounter between Jimi and Eric at that gathering in London became a turning point for both musicians. For Jimi, it was a moment of clarity, a confirmation that he was on the right path, that his revolutionary approach to the guitar was the future of rock music. For Eric, it was a moment of reckoning, a challenge to his assumptions about his own talent and his place in the music world. This confrontation between two legends reveals the intense competition and artistic differences that shaped rock music. If you're captivated by this story, please subscribe to our channel for more exclusive narratives about the rivalries and relationships between music's greatest icons. In the months and years that followed the encounter at the gathering, both Jimi Hendrix and Eric Clapton continued to evolve as musicians, but they did so in very different ways. Jimi continued to push the boundaries of what was possible with the electric guitar, releasing album after album that showcased his innovative approach to music. Albums like Axis, Bold as Love, and Electric Ladyland demonstrated his continued growth as an artist, his willingness to experiment with new sounds and new approaches to songwriting and arrangement. Eric Clapton, meanwhile, began to move away from the blues rock style that had defined Cream. After Cream disbanded in 1968, Clapton pursued a more introspective and acoustic-oriented approach to music. He began to explore different genres, different styles, different ways of expressing himself as a musician. In some ways, Jimi's words had pushed Eric to question his own artistic direction and to seek out new paths for his creativity. But the encounter between Jimi and Eric also had a deeper impact on both musicians. For Jimi, it was a moment of validation, a confirmation that his revolutionary approach to music was the right path. But it was also a moment that highlighted the isolation that came with being a visionary, with being ahead of your time. Jimi was creating music that was unlike anything anyone had ever heard before, but that also meant that he was often misunderstood, often criticized, often isolated from the mainstream music community. For Eric Clapton, the encounter was more complicated. On one level, it was a blow to his ego, a moment when he was forced to confront the reality that he was not the greatest guitarist of his generation, that there was someone else who was pushing the boundaries of music in ways that he had not imagined. But on another level, it was also liberating. It freed him from the pressure of trying to be the best, of trying to compete with Jimi on Jimi's terms. Instead, it allowed him to pursue his own artistic vision, to develop his own unique style and approach to music. In interviews in the years that followed, Eric Clapton would occasionally reference the encounter with Jimi, though he was always somewhat reluctant to discuss it in detail. He acknowledged that Jimi was a genius, that he had fundamentally changed what was possible with the electric guitar. But he also defended his own approach to music, arguing that there was value in honoring the blues tradition, in playing the music with respect and authenticity. Jimi, for his part, rarely spoke publicly about the encounter. But in private conversations with friends and colleagues, he would sometimes reference what he had said to Eric, and he would express some regret about the harshness of his words. Jimi was not a cruel person, and he did not take pleasure in diminishing others or in making them feel bad about themselves. He had spoken the truth as he saw it, but he also understood that his words had hurt Eric, and that was something that weighed on him. The relationship between Jimi and Eric remained cordial but distant in the years that followed. They would occasionally encounter each other at music industry events or at performances, and they would exchange pleasantries, but there was always an underlying tension, a reminder of that night when Jimi had told Eric that he was nothing to him. Other musicians in the community began to reflect on what the encounter between Jimi and Eric represented. Some saw it as a moment of artistic honesty, a time when a visionary artist had spoken truth to power, when someone who was pushing the boundaries of music had challenged someone who was content to work within established traditions. Others saw it as a moment of unnecessary cruelty, a time when one musician had diminished another in order to elevate himself. But perhaps the most important thing about the encounter was what it revealed about the nature of artistic innovation and artistic tradition. Jimi represented the future, the possibility of creating something entirely new, of pushing the boundaries of what was possible with music and with the electric guitar. Eric represented the past, the importance of honoring tradition, of learning from those who came before, of playing music with respect and authenticity. Both approaches had value. Both were important. But in the moment of their confrontation, Jimi was right that they represented fundamentally different visions of what music could be and what the role of the musician should be. Jimi was not just playing the guitar, he was reinventing it. Eric was playing the guitar as it had been played before, but he was doing it with skill and authenticity. The encounter between Jimi and Eric also reflected the broader cultural and racial tensions of the 1960s. Jimi was a Black American musician who was achieving unprecedented success in a predominantly white industry. Eric was a white British musician who had learned the blues from American masters. The question of who had the right to play the blues, who could authentically represent the blues tradition, was a contentious one, and the encounter between Jimi and Eric was, in some ways, a manifestation of these larger cultural debates. In the years that followed, both Jimi and Eric would continue to be recognized as among the greatest guitarists of their generation. But their legacies would be different. Jimi would be remembered as a revolutionary, a visionary who fundamentally changed what was possible with the electric guitar. Eric would be remembered as a skilled musician who honored the blues tradition while also pushing it forward in his own way. The encounter between Jimi and Eric at that gathering in London in 1968 became one of the most famous moments in rock and roll history, a moment when two of the greatest guitarists of their generation came face to face with the fundamental differences in their artistic visions. It was a moment of truth, a moment when the mask of civility was dropped and raw artistic honesty was spoken. More than 50 years have passed since that night when Jimi Hendrix told Eric Clapton, "You are nothing to me." In that time, both musicians have passed away, and their legacies have been cemented in the history of rock and roll. But the encounter between them continues to resonate, continues to be discussed and debated by musicians, critics, and fans around the world. Jimi Hendrix died in 1970 at the age of 27, just 2 years after the encounter with Eric Clapton. His death was tragic and somewhat mysterious, but his legacy has only grown in the decades since. He is widely recognized as one of the greatest musicians who ever lived, a visionary who fundamentally changed what was possible with the electric guitar. His influence can be heard in countless musicians who came after him, in the way that modern guitarists approach their instrument, in the way that rock music has evolved and developed. Eric Clapton continued to have a long and successful career after his encounter with Jimi. He went on to become one of the most commercially successful musicians of all time, with a career that has spanned more than 5 decades. He has won numerous Grammy Awards, has been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and has sold millions of albums around the world. But despite his commercial success, Eric has always been somewhat overshadowed by the memory of Jimi Hendrix, by the sense that Jimi represented something that Eric could never quite achieve, a fundamental reimagining of what was possible with the electric guitar. In interviews in his later years, Eric Clapton has spoken more openly about his relationship with Jimi and about the impact that Jimi had on his career. He has acknowledged that Jimi was a genius, that he fundamentally changed what was possible with the electric guitar, and that his influence on rock music cannot be overstated. But he has also defended his own approach to music, arguing that there is value in honoring tradition, in learning from those who came before, in playing music with respect and authenticity. The encounter between Jimi and Eric has become a touchstone in discussions about artistic innovation, about the relationship between tradition and innovation, about the nature of genius and talent. Musicians and critics have debated what Jimi meant when he said that Eric was nothing to him, and what that statement reveals about the nature of artistic vision and artistic competition. Some have argued that Jimi's statement was too harsh, that it was unfair to dismiss Eric's contributions to music simply because Eric was not pushing the boundaries of the guitar in the same way that Jimi was. Others have argued that Jimi was simply being honest, that he was acknowledging a fundamental truth about their respective approaches to music and to the guitar. But perhaps the most important thing about the encounter is what it reveals about the nature of artistic genius. Jimi Hendrix was not just a skilled guitarist. He was a visionary, an artist who had a fundamentally different vision of what was possible with music and with the electric guitar. He was not content to play the music as it had been played before. He wanted to create something entirely new, something that had never existed before. Eric Clapton, on the other hand, was a skilled musician who had learned from the masters, who had studied the blues tradition and had learned to play it with authenticity and respect. His approach was different from Jimi's, but it was no less valid. Both approaches had value. Both were important, but they represented fundamentally different visions of what music could be. The encounter between Jimi and Eric also reveals something about the nature of competition in the arts. In sports, competition is often seen as healthy, as something that pushes athletes to be better, to achieve more. But in the arts, competition is often viewed with suspicion, as something that is antithetical to the creative process. Yet the encounter between Jimi and Eric suggests that competition, or at least the awareness of competition, can be a powerful force in driving artistic innovation and growth. Jimi was aware that Eric was being hailed as one of the greatest guitarists of his generation, and that awareness pushed Jimi to continue to innovate, to continue to push the boundaries of what was possible with the guitar. Eric, for his part, was aware that Jimi was doing things with the guitar that he had never imagined, and that awareness pushed Eric to question his own approach to music and to seek out new paths for his creativity. Today, more than 50 years after the encounter, both Jimi Hendrix and Eric Clapton are recognized as among the greatest guitarists of all time. Their legacies are secure. Their influence on rock music is undeniable. But the encounter between them remains a powerful reminder of the nature of artistic genius, of the importance of pushing boundaries, of the value of both innovation and tradition. The statement that Jimi made to Eric, "You are nothing to me," was harsh, but it was also true in a certain sense. Jimi was not saying that Eric had no value as a musician or as a person. He was saying that Eric represented a different approach to music, an approach that was rooted in the past rather than the future. Jimi was looking forward, trying to create something entirely new, while Eric was looking backward, trying to honor and preserve the traditions that had come before. Both approaches are important. Both are necessary. The world needs visionaries like Jimi who push the boundaries of what is possible, who create something entirely new. But the world also needs musicians like Eric who honor tradition, who learn from those who came before, who play music with respect and authenticity. The encounter between Jimi and Eric at that gathering in London in 1968 was a moment when these two different approaches to music came into direct conflict. It was a moment of truth, a moment when the mask of civility was dropped and raw artistic honesty was spoken. And it was a moment that has continued to resonate through the decades, a reminder of the power of artistic vision, the importance of pushing boundaries, and the complex relationship between tradition and innovation in the arts. In the end, the story of Jimi and Eric is not just a story about two guitarists and a moment of confrontation. It is a story about the nature of artistic genius, about the importance of vision and innovation, about the value of both tradition and experimentation. It is a story that continues to inspire musicians and artists around the world, a reminder that the greatest art often comes from those who are willing to challenge the status quo, to push the boundaries of what is possible, and to create something entirely new. This incredible story about the rivalry between two guitar legends has revealed the depths of artistic competition and vision in rock history. If you've been moved by this narrative, please subscribe to our channel for more exclusive stories about the legends who shaped music. Like this video to show your support, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this famous encounter and what it means for artistic innovation. Your engagement helps us continue creating these powerful narratives that celebrate the human stories behind the greatest artists of all time.